Hello everybody, this is Mr. Matthews and this is a Loom lecture, help for A-level students on Othello. So I'm just taking a drink there. I will be having a look at aspects of Othello. If you could take some notes, please, that would be great. Thank you. So, there you have Kenneth Branagh as Iago, and you can see he's manipulating Othello with all these wicked ideas. So this is the story of a great figure, a tragic hero, has tremendous abilities, tremendous potential, but a severe weakness, which we will look at in terms of jealousy. First question that you might want to ask is, when did Shakespeare write the play and when was the play performed? The answer to that is 1603, so that's right at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, going into the reign of James I. So that is when Shakespeare wrote the play. He had already written Hamlet. That was a little bit earlier, but he'd still to write both King Lear and Macbeth. So those are the four great tragedies, and they came slightly later. What does it mean to say that Othello was the Moor of Venice? Well, obviously, he lived in Venice, but he came from North Africa. So I'll read through this. The word Moor now refers to the Islamic Arabic inhabitants of North Africa who conquered Spain in the 8th century. But the term was used rather broadly in the period and was sometimes applied to Africans from other regions. So Othello, in a sense, comes from North Africa. We would assume that originally he was a Muslim. That is not mentioned in the play, and he's actually fighting against the Turks. He's actually fighting for the Christian Republic of Venice. So in a sense, that is rather strange. I can't really answer that, but although he would, as a Moor, have an Islamic background, he's actually serving a Christian ruler. So make of that what you will. Now, racism. Is there any element of racism in Othello? Or does it really matter whether Othello's skin was light or whether it was dark? Othello's darkness or blackness is alluded to many times in the play, but Shakespeare and other Elizabethans frequently describe brunette or darker than average Europeans as black. The opposition of black and white imagery that runs throughout Othello is certainly a marker of difference between Othello and his European peers, but the difference is never quite so racially specific as a modern reader might imagine it to be. At this time, those who came from a different culture, a different colour skin, there was prejudice, but the kind of racism that developed in later centuries was the result of the slave trade. And the slave trade, in terms of taking African people from West Africa to the New World, had not really got underway by then. It was still in its infancy. So I don't think that racism as such is a factor. However, there could be a kind of subconsciousness about this because Othello is not European. And there could be a question mark about him. But in a sense, he comes across as a noble figure with his faults. And the thing is, if you were to accuse Shakespeare of racism, you'd have to say that Iago, who is a thoroughly evil character, is actually white. So I don't think that in a sense you can accuse Shakespeare of outright racism. And the thing about darkness is that if you think of Macbeth, there's no racism there in terms of the darkness of Macbeth. It's simply that traditionally the idea of darkness and night has been associated with evil without any racist connotations at all. Okay. If anybody is racist, it is Iago, and he plays upon that. He plays upon the otherness of Othello, that Othello is not European. He goes to Desdemona's father, Senator Brabantio. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tapping your white ewe. So he's comparing Othello to a black ram and the idea of black and white. And this whole thing about the whiteness of Desdemona and the blackness of Othello could be a factor. Could be a factor. So there could be an underlying sense of a kind of a racial tension, but not the racism that we would imagine. That Shakespeare is not saying that all black people are evil or whatever. It's not that kind of thing at all. Tragic hero. At the centre of tragedy is its hero, the protagonist. Both the Greek and Shakespearean tragedies have the same kind of tragic hero. The tragic hero is a towering personality in his state, hails from the high stratum of society and holds high position. The heroes fall due to some flaw in their character. His wrong judgment lead him to face his death. In Greek tragedy, fate also plays an important role in the fall of a hero. So, we can say that Othello is a great figure. He has wonderful poetic utterances. He talks about mysterious things that have happened in his past life, the anthropology and so forth, these sort of mythical animals. He's a great general. It's like Macbeth, who was a great general for King Duncan. He's a great general for the Venetian Republic. He has won many victories. He has seen off the Turks. And as I said, there's an issue there because as a Moor, he would be Muslim. So he's like a Muslim serving the Christian Republic against other Muslims, which is quite interesting. But he falls from his position because of this problem of jealousy. This is a fatal flaw. Beware of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster. Okay. So, this green-eyed monster. Othello is easily taken in by Iago's lies and manipulation because of his age, his race, and because he loves too much. When Iago tells Othello of the handkerchief, he has the evidence necessary to prove Desdemona's unfaithfulness. It is now that the jealousy sinks deep into Othello's soul and starts to destroy his mind. Now, it could be that he feels insecure because he is of a different race. He feels that, perhaps in marrying Desdemona, he has offended her father. He's offended kind of Venetian society. So is it that there is this underlying fear of a mixed race marriage? That is a possibility. Or it could be that if Othello was white, it would make the blindest bit of difference. It is simply that he has this problem of jealousy. And he's taken in very easily. He does not require huge amounts of evidence, and he is manipulated by Iago very, very easily. Now, that is obviously a major flaw in terms of his personality. So I think that is something that you should put down in your notes. So jealousy is a major problem for Othello. Okay. character of Desdemona, she is extremely beautiful. She is extremely pleasant. She is extremely virtuous. She does not deserve to die in the way that she does. And it's almost as if we as the audience, the people who are watching the play, cannot believe that Othello could actually believe that Desdemona was other than true and righteous and faithful to him. So there is this sort of, in a sense, I think there could be an underlying, kind of underlying racial thing about the kind of dark-skinned man and the white-skinned lady kind of thing, because that is something which could have been a factor for Shakespeare. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but it could have been of some significance, okay? Now, the murder of Desdemona is quite extraordinary. He comes into the chamber with his candle and he compares the candle going out with the life of Desdemona. It is the cause, my soul. And of course he realizes that if he snuffs out the candle, he can easily bring the candle back to life again by relighting it. The former light relume. There's no problem with that at all. But if he takes away the life of Desdemona, there is no way that he can bring that back. And he realizes that, he is facing a monumental step as to what he's actually going to do. Is he actually going to go through with this? So it's like Macbeth, as he's about to murder King Duncan. There's a huge step that he must take, and he's emotionally really charged up to this step. So I think that is extremely significant and important. The way in which Shakespeare shows the murder of Desdemona. And of course, he's also really sorry for doing it, but he believes he must do it because there's this terrible injustice that she has been disloyal to him. He never considers whether there's any real evidence. He's fooled by the handkerchief. He's completely fooled by the manipulative way in which Iago is behaving. But he feels that he must do this because this is a terrible wrong that has been done to him and has been done to the idea of justice, the fact that she, who should be loyal and faithful, it's quite extraordinary because we as the audience know that Desdemona is completely innocent. We as the audience know that Iago has completely fabricated all of this story, and yet he cannot understand that. And of course, when he realizes that he has been fooled, he then takes his own life. He then as the honourable thing and takes himself out of it after he's committed this appalling murder. Okay. So Othello is the tragic hero. Othello is blinded towards Iago's manipulating words and believes his false accusations of Desdemona's adultery with Cassio. Othello's blindness is clearly illustrated in the following quote: "My friend, thy husband, honest Iago." He's completely fooled. And of course the irony, the brilliant use of irony there in terms of saying honest twice. And of course it's completely the opposite. Even those around Othello, such as Emilia, were able to see Iago's lies that Othello could not see. This is evident in the following quote: "You told a lie, an odious, damned lie, upon my soul a lie, a wicked lie. She false with Cassio? Did you say with Cassio?" So in a sense, he comes across as being very easily manipulated. Emilia can see through her husband's lies, really easily. He's taken in by Iago in the most appalling way. Othello took the love that he had for Desdemona for granted because he trusted one of his men, Iago, more than his own beloved wife. She's like a liar gone to burning hell. 'Twas that I had killed her. By killing Desdemona, whom he loved, Othello certainly loses some of the sympathy of the audience, and we find it difficult to recognise such actions as heroic. The other thing is the way in which his language changes. In the early part of the play, when everything's fine, his language is majestic, it's very poetic, it's very high and noble. One critic called it the Othello music. But then as he's dragged down by Iago, he starts to talk about Desdemona in animalistic terms. You can find the quotes for yourself and see how his language changes. Now, this is the idea that Iago is dragging him down to his low level. Othello has been dragged down. And you can fit that in with the idea of the tragic hero. He has so much going for him at the start of the play, but his weaknesses are so huge that he's going to be dragged down to that very, very, very low level. Okay? Now, you may in GCSE have studied Macbeth. I think Macbeth is probably the best known of all Shakespeare's plays to students in general in terms of schools. So it's interesting to do a little comparison with Macbeth. Othello is manipulated by Iago, and he turns from the great hero to the murderer of his own beloved wife. An appalling crime, okay? Macbeth is manipulated by his wife, Lady Macbeth, who taunts him, and then he goes to kill King Duncan. So there's this sense that both of these characters are manipulated. And I suppose you could, in an answer in the exam, you could actually consider the way in which manipulation can turn somebody's head. Manipulation can transform somebody from a noble character, from a respected character, into a murderer. Okay? So I don't think there's any harm in a comparison between Othello and Macbeth. Now let's move on to Iago. The great romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who lived in the early 19th century, he argued that Iago had no motive for his horrible behaviour, his malignity, his evil. He just kind of enjoyed committing evil for the sake of committing evil. Now that is quite an extraordinary thing to say. However, in Iago's soliloquy, he does suggest that there might be a kind of reason. So we'll have a look at this. Thus do I ever make my fool my purse, for I mine own gain knowledge should profane. If I would time expend with such a snipe, but for my sport and profit I hate the more. And it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he's done my office. I know not if this be true, but I for mere suspicion in that kind will do as if for surety. He holds me well, the better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man, let me see now. So he, as if he's trying to suggest that the Moor has committed adultery with his wife, but that may be just an excuse. Later on he says, how now, let's see, after some time to abuse Othello's ear, that he is too familiar with his wife. He hath a person and a smooth dispose, to be suspected, framed, to make women false. The Moor is of a free and open nature, that thinks men honest, but seem to be so, and will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are. I haven't. I have it. It is engendered hell and night, must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. So if we look at what Coleridge says, motiveless malignity, he can see that the Moor is somebody who can be fooled. He has a naivety. He has an incredible weakness that he can exploit. Thinks men honest. I can come across as honest and I can fool him. And I can lead him tenderly by the nose as asses are. So he's comparing Othello to an ass. He's talking about stupidity. He is insulting him. And then hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. So it seems that he is only doing it out of a sheer love of devilment. Sheer evil. He enjoys the way in which he's going to manipulate Othello, and he's going to destroy Othello. And he must realize, surely he must realize, that one consequence of this is that Othello will be so enraged and will be so burned up by jealousy that he will do something quite incredible, and that he will actually kill his wife. Now this is really appalling evil. And therefore, when we look into the mind of Iago, we are looking at a very dark and wicked figure indeed. So we're looking into the idea of the heart of darkness, to quote from the book that Joseph Conrad wrote about evil in the European empires in the 19th century. This is about the heart of darkness within an individual. Okay. A psychopath. This is a little bit cheeky because it's got all the stuff about how you would describe a psychopath, and it's got 4 former United States presidents. You've got George Bush, father and son, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. I don't know whether he's whoever has produced this is taking a pop at these ex-presidents. But anyway, we'll ignore that. Let's have a look at the characteristics of a psychopath, and then you can link that with the character of Iago. Aggressive, callous, and cunning. Well, that's certainly so. Complete absence of conscience and empathy. He does not care how much damage he does. Very adept at manipulating others, especially emotionally. Willingness to engage in immoral criminal conduct. Willingness to take what they want and to do as they please, regardless of who is hurt or wronged. A deceptive ability to appear outwardly benevolent. It's perfect, isn't it, for Iago. Superficially charming. Ways to hide purely selfish motives. Willingness to use intimidation and violence to control others in order to satisfy their own needs. Willingness to intentionally violate the basic inherent human rights of others. Complete absence of any sense of guilt or remorse for the harm that actions have caused to others. Rationalization of their own immoral behavior. Will attempt to lay blame upon someone else for their own conduct. Didn't quite do that perhaps, but whatever. Denial will deny that they're their own wrongdoing outright when they're challenged by a milieu, etc. Utter contemptuousness towards the feelings and desires of their fellow beings. That is Iago in a nutshell. Pathological lying will say anything without any concern for truth in order to advance their own hidden agendas. Ability to feign normal human emotions and empathy. Severely distorted sense of the consequences of their own actions. Total failure to accept any responsibility for their own society and their own socially irresponsible ways. Strong belief that they will never be brought to justice for their criminal behaviour. What I'd like you to do, I'm going to I'm going to stop talking for a little while. I want you to look at some of those characteristics in the PowerPoint and just jot them down and think about how they apply to the character of Iago. I look at that one which says utter contemptuousness towards the feelings and desires of their fellow human beings. There is a cruelty within Iago, and the way in which he enjoys seeing Othello suffer emotionally. And it is what you could describe as pure sadism. It is the joy in seeing someone else suffer. It's the pleasure of sheer wickedness. And I think that is very, very strong. Complete absence of conscience and empathy. The fact he doesn't seem to have any conscience at all and has no sense of guilt for what he has done. That is quite extraordinary. It's very powerful, okay? So I think it's worth jotting those points down. So is it that the devil has gone into Othello? Now, in the Middle Ages, when dramatic productions were put on, the equivalent of Shakespeare's dramatic productions in a later age, in the Elizabethan age, there were stock characters in medieval drama, what were called the morality plays and the mystery plays. And one of the stock characters was the devil, was Satan, who represented absolute evil. And of course, he was the great enemy of God. Now, there are references to Iago as being the devil, and at the end of the play, Othello looks to his behind to see whether he has a tail. This idea in tradition that the devil has a tail, and that is characteristic. It's also in the Bible. It says that when Judas Iscariot went about the whole business of betraying Jesus, the devil entered his soul that night where he betrayed Jesus. So is it that you can actually let Iago off the hook as an individual by saying, well, he's under the control of the devil, he's manipulated by the devil? Well, Shakespeare was interested in evil, and he was interested in evil characters, and he had a brilliant way of writing about evil characters. Richard III, for example, which came a long time before Othello, presents a very, very wicked king. I mean, the real Richard III was nothing like as bad as that. It's historically incredibly inaccurate, but nevertheless, he presents Richard as manipulative, as completely wicked, and as somebody who will murder, in this case, 2 children in order to take the throne of England, because they have a claim to the throne, the so-called princes in the tower. But there is a difference between Richard III and Iago. Iago is of a even greater level of evil than Richard III, because towards the end of the play, Richard III has some bad dreams before his final battle, where he will be defeated by Henry Tudor. And it seems that he has some kind of conscience, because it's tearing away all the people he's killed in his life. and their ghosts come back to him in the same way as Banquo's ghost comes back to Macbeth. So he has a conscience. Iago is a step further in devilment, in that even at the end, he shows no remorse whatsoever. It is pure evil all the way through. So therefore, if we go back to that thing about the psychopath, you could pick any of those characteristics to talk about the fact that he's a total failure to accept any responsibility for their own socially irresponsible ways. No sense of strong belief they'll never be brought to justice for their criminal behaviour, and complete absence of conscience and empathy. So, whereas Richard III almost reaches that level of wickedness, Iago doesn't quite do it. The other thing is that, and this is slightly disturbing, in that if you were to ask somebody who's the most interesting character in the play, they'd probably say Iago, because there is something which is fascinating with evil. It's horrible, it's terrifying, and yet, at the same time, it's kind of fascinating. If you think about how many people enjoy reading books about crime, it could be fictional crime or it could be real crime. Think about how criminals who've done awful things are interested. The fascination with Jack the Ripper, the fascination with the Moor's murderers, the fascination with the Cray twins. Again and again, people seem to be interested in the darker side of life, whereas in a sense, the sort of wonderful character of Desdemona seems a little bit boring by comparison. So it's this idea that perhaps Shakespeare was himself fascinated by the idea of evil and realised that other people were fascinated by the idea of evil, and he's gonna play on that, and that he certainly had an ability to put over evil characters, Richard III, and then Iago, and there were many others as well in his plays. The amount of cruelty that you get, and the amount of violence that you get in many of Shakespeare's plays, his history plays, the Roman plays, etc., is quite large indeed, and there is a huge emphasis on this idea of wickedness. I mean, if you think again, how many books have been written about Hitler ever since he was around, ever since the end of the Second World War? He never ceases to fascinate people, and another author would try and have another look at an aspect of Hitler's life which just not been studied. So it's this idea that evil has a fascination. Another thing you can put in is that Shakespeare may have been influenced by this character Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was around before the time of Shakespeare, and he was the great political thinker who seemed to suggest that a great ruler should be ruthless at times and should be realistic, should not concern himself or herself with standard Christian morality. Elizabeth I, in fact, read Machiavelli and understood some of the points that he was putting across. So he had a reputation, did Machiavelli, for wickedness. This sort of dark idea of Machiavelli compared with the devil, because his first name, Niccolo, if you translate that into English, is Nicholas or Nick, and Old Nick is a nickname for the devil. He was not as bad as he was actually as he was presented at the time. He's much more a nuanced character in terms of his political philosophy, but at the same time, he is he would have been seen as the embodiment of evil. And I think, you could actually put down in your answer about Iago, you could say that perhaps Shakespeare is showing him as a Machiavellian figure. So this idea of the wickedness of Machiavelli is put on to the character of Iago. So you can say he is Machiavellian. And you can certainly compare Iago with Richard III and the way in which Shakespeare presents Richard III in terms of his manipulation, in terms of his love of evil for the sake of evil, though there is evidence that he does have a conscience and Iago has no conscience. So it's almost as if he could be the most evil character that Shakespeare ever created. A man who would fit in with the whole idea of the psychopath, with the characteristics of the psychopath, okay? My last slide is that a psychologist, an evolutionary psychologist called Robin Dunbar, who's seen there, has been fascinated by the play Othello because he argues it shows how the way in which manipulation works and the way in which the characters interact, it shows how the human mind is very different to any other kind of mind in the animal kingdom. If you support the idea of evolution, you believe that human beings are connected to the rest of nature. They are in effect animals, but they're animals with a brain that is so complex, that is so developed, that they can do things and they can engage in behavior that no other animals, not even chimpanzees or whatever, can actually do. And he says that Shakespeare is very good at this, as showing the way in which there is interaction, and the way in which you can make stories, and the way that you can use gossip to show how human beings interact. So the way, for example, that Iago will use Michael Cassio and will use Rodrigo and will use Othello and manipulate them is quite extraordinary. And no other animals, apart from human beings, can actually do that. So that's a point that you can make. His name is Robin Dunbar, okay? Okay, then, I think that brings my Loom lecture to a conclusion. So what are the key points? The Moor reference to somebody who comes from North Africa. There are elements of racism in the play, but I wouldn't make too much of it. I think the key point is the most evil character in the play is not black. That's Iago, not Othello. If it was the other way around, then you could accuse Shakespeare of outright racism. Although with Iago's statements, he uses racist language in order to influence the father of Desdemona. The idea of the tragic hero. Othello, at the beginning of the play, comes across as high-minded and noble, but he will be dragged down. He will be pushed down appallingly low. So he is this tragic hero, okay? His vice, his weakness is jealousy. Macbeth's weakness was ambition. So you can look at this idea that at the heart of every tragic figure in a Shakespeare tragedy, there is a weakness. And of course, this will lead to the death of Desdemona. The actual murder of Desdemona is described by Shakespeare really brilliantly. So what I would like you to do is to read through the murder scene and consider the richness of language, consider the way in which Shakespeare describes how Othello comes into her chamber and how he murders her, and how he is agonizing with himself about whether he should be murdering her or not. Okay, the tragic hero, he has these wonderful characteristics, but he has such a weakness that he could be manipulated. That that it's really quite extraordinary how easily that he is manipulated. Okay, comparison with Macbeth, with Lady Macbeth as the manipulator in the case of Macbeth, and with Iago in the case of Othello. The Psychopaths. Have a look in your computer of examples of real life psychopaths in terms of crime. Have a look at their criminal behaviour. Have a look at what they would have said to psychologists when they were in prison. Because although Shakespeare lived at a time before the development of psychology as a science, and he would not have used the word psychopath, of course. This is a modern 20th century, 21st century idea. But nevertheless, he understood in his own way the sheer wickedness of Iago. And although he wasn't able to use the science of psychology, we can identify the psychopathic tendencies that he showed there. The idea of evil, the devil, but this is a point I think I should also make. I think that Shakespeare is not saying that it's just the devil has entered into Othello. It's not all the devil's fault. There is something within his personality. Now, how do you explain motiveness, malignity? Well, you explain it in terms of a psychopathic behavior. Many people commit evil with a motive. This is where you could bring in a comparison with Macbeth. He commits evil because he has a motive. He wants to become the next King of Scotland, and he has to kill King Duncan in order to become the King of Scotland. So he has a motive for his wickedness. Iago does not have a motive. So that is what you can make there in terms of comparison. But I don't think that Shakespeare was trying to say that the devil had entered into Iago. Shakespeare's tragedies are at a bit more sophisticated level than that. That's the kind of thing you would have seen in a medieval drama, which would have been simplistic because the devil was a stock character. Whereas Shakespeare, I think, is trying to say that Iago is responsible for with some reason for his own evil. He just enjoys committing evil because somehow it gives him a thrill, it gives him satisfaction to see someone else suffer. Okay, so that is the end of my Loom lecture. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much indeed.